Okay,
Well,
happy.
good evening, or indeed good morning to everyone all around the world for this seminar, the EU, Australia, New Zealand and Cheese. I'm Dr. Matt Harvey of Victoria University in Melbourne, appearing as Treasurer of the European Studies Association, Australia and New Zealand. And I'm in Melbourne in lockdown, and we have a presenter from Canberra and presenter from New Zealand and Discussant from also here in Melbourne. And I gather we have people joining us from many places. So I welcome you all. I note that this event is being recorded. I also want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I'm on and any others where you are. I also want to thank our hosts, the ESAANZ Melbourne branch, the ANU Centre for European Studies, the Erasmus Plus program of the European Union, and the RMIT Centre of Excellence in European Studies. So tonight we have two presenters, Dr. Hazel Moir, who's an Adjunct Associate Professor at the ANU Centre for European Studies Third Country Engagement with EU Trade Policy Project, and Dr. John Barker of John Barker Law, a New Zealand food and beverage lawyer. And our discussant will be Professor Bruce Wilson, the Director of the RMIT Centre. So I wanted to have a cheese platter available. And of course, this is one of the downsides of Zoom, that you can't cater such a function. But I hope that people have got some cheese and a glass of wine. I'm having a glass of Beaujolais, which was what kicked off the real controversy over GIs in Australia and led to the EU-Australia wine agreements. And I've gathered together some cheese that seemed to fit the bill as some Maffra White Wensleydale, so a British appellation, so I guess that's outside the EU for now. Some Riverina cracked pepper halloumi that's said to be in a Cyprus style, and some brie, so from Shale Point, said to be Australian brie. So I'm getting into the spirit, and I hope that you are as well. But without further ado, I'll ask Hazel to give us her presentation.
Very much, Matt. I too would like to start by acknowledging that I'm speaking from Ngunnawal territory and would like to pay my respects to the Ngunnawal people and their leaders, past, present and emerging. Now, Matt's asked me to focus today in talking about the EU and its GI demands in the current trade negotiations to focus on the implications for the cheese industry, which I will do, but I need to give you a little bit of context before we get to cheese. So just very briefly, these are the things that the EU is seeking in the trade treaty. The first two items I'll talk about briefly next. It's the standard, how much privilege do they want to give to the person who has a GI name? Then they want us to shift from a trademark style to an EU style GI regulatory system. They want us to agree specific GI names, and that's what I'll mostly talk about today. And mostly in respect with the cheese industry. They also want us to put in place border protections that I consider are disproportionate. And they want us to fund a whole bunch of GI promotional activities, in other words, to go around proselytizing in favor of EU-style GIs. So that's the package of what the EU is looking for. Now, the core of the debate between the EU and the New World is the difference between Article 22 and Article 23 of the Trade-Related Intellectual Property Rights Treaty, which is one of the set of WTO treaties that was agreed in the Uruguay round. Now, the basic level of protection for a GI is in Article 22. It's entirely non-contentious. It simply repeats what is in the old 19th century Paris Convention, Article 10 bis, the labels on a product shouldn't mislead consumers and they shouldn't constitute unfair competition. Well, of course, you can debate endlessly what constitutes misleading consumers and what constitutes unfair competition. And we'll talk about that. But the EU, which is the body that pushed GIs into the TRIPS agreement, was very much in favour of Article 23, which has a stronger restraint on trade in the labelling that you can put on a product with a GI name. It prevents the use of qualifiers, and I'd like to show you what these are. These are pictures of 3 cheeses available on the Australian market that are made either in Australia or New Zealand. They all use product names, Havarti, Parmesan, that are originally European names, but brought to Australia and New Zealand by emigrants from Europe who started up a tradition of making European foods, and indeed of introducing a variety of European foods right across the local community. So effectively they built, Italian immigrants to Australia built a market in Australia for Italian food products. So this difference between Article 22 and Article 23 has got a lot to do with what Europeans compared to New World people consider as acceptable labelling on a product. And since the adoption of their new approach to trade treaties in 2006, the EU agenda has been about extending these Article 23 privileges from wines to foods. So if the EU had its way, this kind of food labelling would not be allowed in Australia. And in many ways, it all comes down to the question of what is a generic name. Are Havarti and Parmesan generic names or not? So, in fact, what the EU wants for us goes further than Article 23. It's TRIPS plus. They want us to not only disallow Parmesan made in New Zealand and packed in Australia, but they also want us to disallow comparative advertising. So, for example, it used to be legal for Perrier to advertise their mineral water in Germany as the champagne of mineral waters. Now, that's no longer the case. That has gone to court, and no, they can't do that anymore. And the reason they can't do that is that by comparing Perrier to champagne, it brings the name champagne into disrepute. Get that, folks? Now, further, in recent years, they've extended their own GI policy to a concept called evocation. So a part of evocation is packaging. So if we look at the picture on the right, the Perfect Italiano Parmesan, made in New Zealand, packed in Australia, but look at the colours on the package. The colours on the package are green and red, and under their evocation principle and under other demands in the EU draft for the treaty, they would disallow packaging that uses the colours of the national flag in Australia for a cheese whose name originated in Italy but has become generic in Australia. So that's the background to what the EU is asking for. Now, they're also asking for us to adopt their regulatory system, which quite frankly is entirely not suitable for Australia. But I've written a submission on that, and that submission is available on the DFAT website under submissions. If you go to the DFAT website and you go to the EU treaty negotiations and you go to GIs, there's a list of submissions, and I've made a number of submissions on the topic, and my last one addresses this, so I won't talk about it now unless it comes up in questions. Now, coming to the names, what are the names that the EU want to have us give special privileges to in Australia? Well, before the adoption of the 2006 new approach to trade treaties, the EU had tabled a list of 41 of the GI names for which they sought global protection. And 19 of these were foodstuffs and 13 were cheeses, and I'm going to show them to you in a minute. But subsequently, in the post-2006 era, when they started negotiating a range of different trade treaties, the number of EU GI products for which they sought privileges overseas has ballooned. Now, when you look at this list of treaties, the treaties that are in black, and the dates are, sorry, I don't know what's gone wrong with my my PowerPoint, but it keeps to like running ahead of me, even if I don't touch it. The lines in black, Korea, Singapore, Vietnam, and Japan, right? Now, the Korean treaty took from 2007, initial negotiations, to finalization in 2015, so quite a long time. And the EU listed 60 names, of which 18 were cheeses. And then you can see, you know, pretty much that kind of range for these things. But now these 4 countries with the completed trade agreements, they are East Asian countries. They have populations who are often lactose intolerant. They do not have a tradition of eating cheese. Cheese markets have developed in these countries, and perhaps the one with the strongest tradition is Vietnam, given its French colonial heritage. But they contrast with the 3 countries in blue, which are Anglo-expansion New World countries with large numbers of British and other European immigrants. They don't have the same issues about lactose intolerance, and they have a strong tradition of eating a variety of cheeses. And furthermore, they have a lot of European immigrants who have commenced cheese production and developed very good, very profitable, competitive companies making cheeses that draw on the original cultural heritage of those immigrants. So you can see that the numbers of products for which the EU is requesting special privileges goes up significantly for Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And overall, about 1/3 of the names they request protection for are for cheese products. Now, these are the 13 cheeses on the original list of 41 names put forward in 2003. And apart from one Spanish cheese in Korea, all of them feature in the post-2006 treaties. But Canada started putting limits. So the 3 there in the Canada column, the CA column, with the asterisk, Canada put limits on those and 2 other cheeses. And the limit is that every existing Canadian producer of Asiago, Fontino, Gorgonzola, and the other 2 is allowed to continue to produce that cheese in perpetuity. And if they sell their business, the new owner can continue to produce that cheese in perpetuity and simply label it as Asiago, Fontino, Gorgonzola, etc. And if a completely new producer starts, they are allowed to make Asiago and to label it Asiago style. In other words, they have a TRIPS Article 22 level of privilege in relation to use of the name. Now, Vietnam came in and copied that. So Vietnam came in and copied those limitations that the Canadians had put on the extent of privileges granted to European cheese product names in Vietnam. The Japanese did something slightly different, and remember, Japanese is not traditionally a culture that eats cheese very much. So they put on 3 kinds of limitations. The ones that says 7 in brackets allows Japanese producers to slice and pack the product in Japan for 7 years after the entry into force of the treaty. Now, it might surprise you to know, but if you take a product, and the court case has been actually about Parma ham, the European court case about Parma ham was whether if you bought a leg of Parma ham, took it home and sliced it and packaged it, you could then still call it Parma ham. And the European Court of Justice says no, you can't take your leg of Parma ham and slice it and package it yourself and still call it Parma ham. I mean, it is Parma ham, but you can't label it as Parma ham. And this is actually a fundamental difference between the Australian approach and the EU approach. That is why I object to us considering adopting the EU approach, because That seems to me to be very anti-competitive in a way that doesn't provide offsetting economic benefits to the restrictions on who can undertake some minor presentational activity. The other limitations in Japan are about prior use of a name and about accepting a name only in its compound form. So, for example, in Japan, grana padano is protected as the compound phrase grana padano, but there is no protection for either the word grana or padano if used separately. So that's the original 13 cheese names. But then we turn to, well, what are they asking for now? Because now we know they're asking for many more than 13 names. In the list that is on the DFAT website of the names the EU wants protected in Australia, there are certain names that the EU has already agreed are generic. And those which affect cheeses have words that are literal translations, like words that mean cheese and blue in other languages, certain types of cheeses, and here we've got a kind of quite interesting case of mozzarella. A mozzarella with no qualifiers is actually a very unusual type of European GI. It's a traditional specialty guaranteed. There's less than 100 of them. Effectively, the recipe is regulated so that you cannot sell mozzarella in Europe unless it follows the regulated recipe. But an Australian could sell mozzarella into Europe if they made it according to that recipe, provided they could find a buyer. So that's an unusual case, but there's very few of them. The critical thing about the names that are so far agreed to be generic is that there's some glaring omissions. Parmesan, with its many translations, has not yet been agreed by the EU, or at least not publicly agreed by the EU, as being a generic name. And grana, which is simply a word meaning grain in Italian, is also not agreed by the EU as being a name in general use. And for fun, kiwi latina. What is kiwi latina? It's not a cheese. No, it's kiwi fruit produced in the Italian province of Latina. And the word kiwi is not yet agreed by the Europeans as being a generic name. So there's some problems so far with the negotiations and generic names. So the two big ones are Parmesan. Now the EU has agreed there's certain names as generic in other treaties. So Parmesan has been agreed to be generic in the Korean Treaty, the Vietnam Treaty, and the Japan Treaty. So why is the EU treating Australia and New Zealand with contempt by not agreeing from the outset that the name Parmesan is generic in our two countries as well? Feta is possibly the most contentious of the names on the EU list. And it's contentious not just in the New World, but also in Europe. There were 4 other nations producing feta, and there were 2 court cases. The first one was won by the opponents of registering feta as a GI. The second one was won by Greece, with the lawyers doing some very unusual statistical analysis, if you can call it that, to support the case. But one of the problems with feta is that it is simply not a place name. So how you can have a geographic name that is not a place is something that considerably upsets many people involved in this debate. Feta is a word meaning slice. I understood it to be a word only in Greek, but it's apparently both in Greek and Italian. Now, if we have some options about feta, we could simply say no to feta as being, just leave feta as it is, don't write it into the treaty. That is likely to be problematic. We should do at least what the Canadians have done and say, well, we'll accept feta, but all our current producers of feta can still produce feta in perpetuity, et cetera, and just simply adopt the same policy as Canada. So that would allow Australian feta and so-called Persian feta to remain on the market. Now, Persian feta, as far as I can tell, is Australian feta, which has been marinated in oil and herbs and spices. But we have two other fetas that are regularly available on the Australian market. That is Danish feta, which is a cow's milk feta, and Bulgarian feta, which is usually goat or sheep's milk. Now, Denmark and Bulgaria, of course, are members of the EU, and the EU is a bit cross with them, but they still make and export feta, and I think they're doing something about it over there. But in the meantime, there's a risk that if our government doesn't stand up for the interests of Australian consumers, that if we agree to what the EU is asking for in respect of feta, that we would actually reduce the choices available for Australian consumers and take those two products away from them. But given how widespread they are, I mean, every major supermarket in Australia has Danish feta in it, and an awful lot have Bulgarian feta as well. So enough with those names. Comparing what the EU is asking for in Australia and New Zealand with what it got in Canada is interesting. So it got the list of 13 from its original list of names. There were another 8 names that appear in all the post-2006 treaties. There's 17 that appear in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And then there's some new names for Australia and New Zealand, and there's some Canada names that aren't demanded in Australia and New Zealand. So I'll put that slide back on later on if people just want to browse through it. Otherwise, go to the DFAT website, GIs, and you'll find it quite readily. Now, Matt asked me to put in a slide saying, what would I like to see, what outcomes would I like to see from the Australia-EU negotiations with respect to GIs? Well, my first ask is, I would really like to see us simply shred the IP chapter. Intellectual property is about monopolies and restraints on trade, and it has no place in any discussion about free trade. It is trade reducing, it is welfare reducing, it is about snouts in the trough, and we shouldn't have a part of it. And there's a lot of other nasties in the IP chapter besides the GI stuff. We're unlikely to get that outcome, right? So if we have to have an IP chapter with GIs in it, what would I like to see? I would like us to see it keep our current trademark system and not adopt the EU style system because it simply wouldn't work in Australia. Australian cheesemakers are not densely settled over the countryside. There's something like 56 cheesemakers in Victoria as a whole, compared to hundreds of people making Parmigiano Reggiano in the 3 or 4 provinces around the city of Parma. So my first ask is that we keep the trademark system, but I think we need to reform it because there's far too much granting of geographic names as trademarks, and that's as bad as approving silly systems for giving special privileges for GI names. As regards the list of names, my view is that any listed names that we agree to protect should have only the Article 22 standard of protection. That all existing Australian producers should be protected in perpetuity in respect of their right to use names that they are currently using. That we should not accept any names that are not geographic. That is an absolute refusal for feta and also for fontina. That we should only accept names that are not misleading, and a number of the proposed names are misleading because they do not actually tell us, although the product is labeled with a geographic place, the materials do not come from that place, and therefore it is actively misleading. We shouldn't accept names that are already registered as certification marks because they have full protection as a GI in Australia. We should focus on compound names, which don't create any problems, and there should be no future additions to the list. Further, we should reject any proposition to proselytize around GIs, and we should only adopt border control measures that are proportionate. Now, but where are we actually? That's what I'd like to see. Where are we actually? Well, we've had 3 to 4 years of negotiations, as some of our colleagues in this seminar can attest. We know that the big issue appears to be, among the negotiators, will we give in on GIs if they give us more market access on some agricultural products? We know that in CETA that didn't happen. We know that in CETA, the sacred cows, if I might use that phrase, of agricultural protectionism remained absolutely in place, and there was no advance over that. And also, the people who will be negatively impacted in terms of accepting GIs are consumers, the cheese industry, and selected processed meat product producers. Whereas if we get more market access for agricultural product, it will be different segments of the Australian industry. And where are the proposals for the winners compensating the losers out of all of that? We've had 2 rounds of public consultations, one in 2019 about the specific names, one in 2020 about the regulatory system. I've already spoken about how displeased I am that the government has provided absolutely no feedback about the hundreds of hours work from myriad different people that went into providing input to government, and we get no feedback. I know that the New Zealanders have provided feedback on the EU regulatory system at least, and that would seem to be an appropriate point at which to turn over to John in New Zealand.
Yes, thank you, Hazel. A good throw there. And John, I believe you have a slideshow as well?
Yes, thank you, Hazel. And I have to say it was a very comprehensive, and that you may find that I cover a little bit of the same ground in what I have prepared. I'm probably, I guess I wasn't really sure about how familiar people are with New Zealand or the New Zealand situation. So I might start a little bit further back and give some explanation about that. I just need to work out how to share my screen. Okay, so kia ora katoa. Just to give a wee bit of introduction to myself, I'm a lawyer specialising in food and beverage. I've worked with the wine industry for a long time, and I have a lot of experience of research and practice in the GI space in New Zealand and Australia, including leading the implementation of New Zealand's GI Act, which is specific to wines and spirits. I do advise clients in New Zealand and Australia on the EU FTAs. So I have to say at the outset, I probably can't really discuss what's not in the public domain there, and I'm not speaking for any of my clients, but there's plenty in the public domain that we certainly can talk about. And obviously, you know, starting with the idea of GIs, as we all know, recognised as an IP right under TRIPS, and you know it should be a global concept. But underneath that global concept, there are a lot of very different understandings, differences of approach, depending on your history of production, the nature of your legal system, the political and policy frameworks you have around GIs. And New Zealand and European Union, and also I think New Zealand and Australia in many ways embody quite significant differences of approach. Even if we start historically from New Zealand, obviously New Zealand was first settled by the Māori people and then colonised by the British. We actually had no native mammals, so there was obviously no indigenous dairy production. It came with the colonisers, and we were sort of treated for a long time as a commodity producer for the UK market. So we're sending big blocks of cheddar cheese and butter over to the UK. But really from the post-World War II period, we started to see a lot more sophistication in our cheese production, particularly with immigration from Europe, a very strong immigration from Holland, particularly, or the Netherlands rather. But also, I guess, just New Zealanders being a bit more exposed to the wider world after that period. And we started to see artisanal cheese production grow in a range of styles. And now it's a very, very strong industry. We have a very wide range of locally produced cheeses. Some of them have been using names, I guess, that are understood in New Zealand differently from how they are in Europe for a very long time now. Obviously, when you're talking about Europe, you're talking about quite a different set of histories and traditions. And we think about the French archetype and recall Charles de Gaulle's comment about the difficulty of managing a country with 400 cheeses. That's, I guess, the archetype, and across the European Union, there are quite a lot of differences in the history of production of cheese from north to south, from east to west, and not necessarily historically always identified in a localized way. I think you could probably make the argument that the homogenizing impact of the European Union and its policy direction has moved a lot of cheese production in that direction. I'm just going to skip through those. Sorry, I just talked about those. So just talking about the legal and political differences, and New Zealand's very similar to Australia in this respect. We're a net exporter, we're very strong free traders. We don't have subsidies or protections around our production. We haven't really had a strong history of GI use, so we don't really have offensive interests, and these things really shape our approach to GIs. We see them as very much we're implementing our TRIPS obligations, but not doing anything further. So GIs are primarily about consumer protection and trade. We don't protect quality. We don't protect the conditions of production. We don't regulate that at all. That's for the producers to do. We very much follow the mantra of the international intellectual property system, which is that first in time, first in right applies. And so the way we regulate in New Zealand, we have obviously familiar with TRIPS having a two-stage production for GIs. So for all GIs other than wine and spirits, we implement the Article 22 protections through our Fair Trading Act, which is basically the equivalent of the old Australian Trade Practices Act, which is now in the Australian Consumer Law. Also, we have the old English tort of passing off, and we also have the trademark system. So there are some GIs, including some cheese GIs, which are protected as certification trademarks. There's a couple that are Gorgonzola and Gruyere at the moment, I think, are either under examination or actively being opposed, but there are a number that are registered. We have a system to implement the higher level protections for wines and spirits, so you can actually register a wine or spirit GI in New Zealand, and the level of protection there is it effectively deems the use of the same or similar word on the same or similar product as being a breach of the Fair Trading Act. Obviously, when we talk about the EU, we're talking about quite a different system, and I think the key thing there is that unlike New Zealand, in the EU, there's a very strong policy agenda and defensive interests for GIs. And I think Hazel made the point very clearly. GIs in the EU are about agricultural policy, much more than, even though they're notionally an IP right, much more they're about agricultural policy. And that's why something very simple like the food and wine GIs are basically managed by DG Agri and not by OHIM, the European office that deals with trademarks. As part of the quality policy, as a pillar of European agricultural policy, you see a lot of support measures in terms of investment and promotion directed towards that GI sector. And that also explains in many ways why the protections for GIs in Europe are different and quite a bit stronger than they are for trademarks. But when you I guess when you kind of come to New Zealand and Europe negotiating a free trade agreement, you've really got the difficulty of marrying these two really different visions of GIs and how they work. And I guess to start off with what's in the public domain, which is the EU's negotiating agenda, essentially this is the EU regulation. Essentially what the ask is to export a European vision of geographical indications to New Zealand, and this is a really difficult ask in the context of a very difficult historical institutional framework that we have in New Zealand. So to come on to a bit more specifics about the cheese side of things, and trying to sort of negotiate between these two different visions. There are obviously two big areas of disconnect. The first is the subject of protection, which is the names, and the second is the scope of protection. There are a bunch of other issues about enforcement, about how long the list is, about border protections and things, but I won't talk about those. Subject of protection, my maths is, I have to admit, not very good, so I'm going to go with Hazel's number of 56 cheese names rather than the 59 I had there. But it is a concern. It's quite a big list of names, and the concern about the length of the list, it's not just about the names on the list, but also about the fact that if you have GIs with these very, very broad rights and rights that extend beyond the rights of trademarks, and they extend in translation and transliteration and to evocation, it casts there's kind of a very broad penumbra around each one of those names where you can't try and seek intellectual property rights or even use common words without running a risk of uncertainty around those rights, even if it's with the most innocent intention in the world. So the long list of names is obviously a concern. I mean, a lot of these names are not really very well known, so there's not necessarily a commercial clash with them or anything of that nature. But there are obviously in that list, and I'll talk about them, and Hazel's already touched on them, names of concern in that they are things that wouldn't necessarily be able to be registered in New Zealand. They are registered in Europe under the particular conditions of European law, but in New Zealand they would be considered non-geographical or generic names. And then there's also the issue of compound names, and particularly the generic element of those. The other issue is really that the question around scope of protection, and it's kind of a principal issue in that we're looking at a situation where Europe is asking for GIs to have rights that are greater for trademarks and greater than trademarks, and that kind of raises issues about equity in the IP system, and also these rights that go beyond consumer protection. And when you go beyond consumer protection, you're protecting the producers and not the consumers. And the question is raised, well, to what extent should New Zealand grant protections for European producers? Sorry, I should have said producers. To what extent should New Zealand grant protections to European producers that don't really have any corresponding consumer benefit in New Zealand? So I'm going to just use a few examples, and Hazel has touched on these ones already, but they kind of illustrate the specific natures of our concerns. Obviously, Parmesan is a contentious one. The GI, as you'll know, is Parmigiano Reggiano, and nobody in New Zealand uses Parmigiano or Reggiano or wants to use it, but Parmesan is a very widely used name. Sorry, I'm talking, this is feta. Yeah, I'm talking about Parmesan. I'll go back to feta. And this was actually a contentious issue within Europe, in that I think obviously German producers wanted to have the right to continue to use Parmesan However, they were prevented from using it on the basis that Parmesan was a sort of a translation of the first part of the Parmigiano Reggiano GI, and its use evoked the Parmigiano Reggiano PDO. And so, this is a real concern about the scope of protection, is that even if it's nobody's going to use Parmigiano Reggiano, if you have a right about evocation, then is it going to stop some of these really quite widely used and generic cheese names? Now, you can just see there, I mean, this is an example. The Parmesan is an example of how it's used in New Zealand, always as Parmesan, and there are varieties from around the world. On the other side, you have the Italian version, Parmigiano Reggiano, and it's always labelled in that way in the New Zealand market. Just going to feta. So this goes back to our initial concern about names that are not protectable in New Zealand, and it's, as Hazel mentioned, a very contested GI. It's not fundamentally geographical. It's the common name for a type of cheese in New Zealand. And if you look at the European cases, in fact, about feta, they were very contested. Feta was only able to be registered because EU law specifically permits non-geographical GIs. To the extent that there was evidence of recognition of the Greekness of feta, if you like, in Greece, that was kind of extended to Europe through the principle of subsidiarity, which obviously doesn't apply in New Zealand. So none of these reasons why feta could be registered in Europe actually apply in New Zealand. And so I guess that's a question of, we should really have the right to decide the legitimacy of some of these GIs according to our own systems. I just pulled some of these down from the web, but this is what you can find from a fairly easy search about how feta is used in New Zealand. So we've got Bulgarian goat feta. You can also buy Bulgarian cow and Bulgarian sheep feta. The Bouton d'Or, the lovely French name, is actually a New Zealand feta made in the Bohemian Czech settlement of Puhoi. We have, I found this very intriguing, a cow cheese feta with a Greek flag on it from Greece. It says Greek product, although of course feta, PDO feta is not allowed to be made from cow's cheese. We have a Danish white feta, and we also have these very tasty looking corn tapas, which are feta and garlic flavored. So, I mean, I guess the point I'm trying to make is that it's a very, very widely used generic term in New Zealand. The last point I'll touch on is about I guess, expanding the concern about evocation. And I guess not just evocation, but, uses that are said to touch on the reputation of a GI. And this is Manchego Cheese. This is another European case where we have the Manchego, which is the PDO cheese. And then for those of you who are familiar with the works of the book Don Quixote de la Mancha, the horse in that book is called Rocinante, which is pictured there, and the windmills there are supposedly an allusion to La Mancha region. And apparently, I didn't know this, but Manchego means that it comes from La Mancha. So this was held to be evocation, even though there's no kind of word there that specifically evokes the geographical origin, because of the imagery that was used. And the concern that we have would be, for example, we have a lot of Gouda cheese in New Zealand that's been produced there for a very long time by Dutch immigrants. They often use Dutch imagery or colours of red, white and blue, which are also the colours of the New Zealand flag. We'd be very concerned about this very expensive concept that catches some, I guess, really quite innocent and genuine uses that are not at all misleading to New Zealand producers. So that's all I had for now. I've probably more than taken up my time, but I guess we can move on to the next part.
Thank you very much, John. So that last picture makes me think that horse cheese is perhaps a frontier not yet met. But now I'd like to call on Professor Bruce Wilson, the Director of the RMIT Centre of Excellence in European Studies, to discuss some of the issues raised. And I'd like to ask people to start putting questions in the chat. And after Bruce's presentation, I'll call on you to ask your question live. So please proceed, Bruce.
Thanks very much indeed, Matt. And let me also begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm sitting, which is the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. And pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Thanks very much indeed to Hazel and to John for their presentations and canvassing of the issues. I think the first thing that needs to be said is you obviously both speak from, dare I say, something of a defensive perspective. You clearly are Australians and Australian New Zealanders who perceive threat from the EU's request demands regarding GIs, and so I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think that's a perfectly reasonable position for you to adopt. But I just note that we don't actually have a protagonist for the EUs on the panel, and I'm certainly not in a position to do that. But I will say a couple of things. I think that the first thing is that, to me, there seems to be no problem whatsoever with acknowledging that through whatever processes and history that they have, the European Union has developed its GI scheme over some period of time, and with a very deliberate process. I certainly wouldn't be one to argue that it's immediately self-evident that all of the outcomes of that process are consistent and that are objectively, verifiable. But I think it's important that we acknowledge that this is not been constructed by the EU just in order to cause mayhem or to be a bargaining chip in our trade negotiation. It's been constructed by the EU very much in terms of a policy and approach that they describe themselves as being about rural development, and where particular rural areas have particular products, particular expertise, particular processes, and each of those three different things are reflected in different ways in different GIs, that where those places have that a particular expertise, that they should be protected from unfair competition, and the way in which the EU sets to do that is through their GI system. That seems to me to be perfectly reasonable, and the points that Hazel and John have made then about how the protagonists from those places have found their ways into our country, other parts of the world, into New Zealand, and have adopted processes from their home place here and produce products here. It seems to me, again, something that's not unnatural and not a particularly provocative activity. So if on the one hand, I'm saying that the EU has a system of GIs, they are perfectly entitled to advocate for and to protect that system, and certainly protect the producers that are part of it. Then how do we find some common ground which respects that on the one hand, and then looks to an amenable outcome in the trade negotiations? I'm a bit different from John and Hazel, because if those of you who don't know me, I come very much from a regional development, regional studies perspective, and in the context of our work, we have a lot of producers who are very concerned about provenance. That the provenance is clearly part of the potential that they see for gaining respect for and gaining value for their products in other markets. The way in which that's recognised in Australia is a matter of debate, and we've certainly facilitated and been part of those debates where some people would argue that, well, you know, Australia is the geographical entity that's recognised in global markets, and you can't expect to get too much more recognition for Gippsland, to name one particular case that I'm closely associated with. You know, it's hard enough getting traction for Australia in global markets. You know, how on earth can you expect to get traction for a GEI for Gippsland? Personally, I think that's a pretty short-sighted approach, and that Gippsland producers, if they believe that they have particular provenance qualities, provenance characteristics that are distinctive and that warrant protection, then they ought to be able to argue for that. And over a period of time, it might be 5, 10, 20 years, then to see what the consequences of that claim on provenance are in wider markets. And of course, we would be expecting the EU to be recognising Gippsland provenance as part of the agreements over geographical indications. To come to some of the detail that both Hazel and John have canvassed, I don't think there's much doubt that most Australian producers, I won't speak for New Zealand, John, I don't know, but most Australian producers who use the European names or allusion to the European names are indeed trying to trade off that European heritage. And part of the strength of my view about that is from the vehemence with which some producers have taken up this argument. If it didn't matter that they were alluding to European heritage, to European products, I'm not sure that they would be so fussed. Perhaps there's a reason, but I'm not sure why that is. If we're confident about our particular production of a certain type of cheese in Gippsland, then why would it need to be referred to as referred to by a European name? And again, I can't myself declaim so much knowledge about cheese, but I do have a fair bit of knowledge about wine and the wine industry. And I think I doubt that there's a winemaker in Australia now who would advocate a return to the days pre the EU-Australia wine agreement. And most Australian winemakers that I know would argue that that agreement was a pretty useful jolt to the local industry in terms of claiming its the distinctiveness of its product and looking very much to selling Australian wine in international markets that did not in any way seem to trade on French or Italian or Spanish or other European identities. So, Matt, that might be enough to provoke some conversation. I guess to put my position simply, I think the EU's clearly developed a GI framework that's got integrity, that has now considerable respect in Europe itself, and that the EU is perfectly entitled to position it as a key part of their claims in an FTA, and that then becomes a process of negotiation as all aspects of the FTA are. I'm in fact an advocate for our looking at how Australians can use some form of a provenance, let's call it a provenance-related scheme, to gain respect and international product attraction for their products. And I mean, it's certainly clear that trademarks do not do that in Australia at present. We don't have an adequate legal form of claiming provenance, to my eye. And I think that the outcome of the FTA negotiations, at least from an Australian point of view, will provide a useful starting point for a conversation in Australia about how we can take the learning from the wine agreement and extend that to a wider range of food products. So hopefully that stimulates some discussion.
Yes, thank you, Bruce. And that was indeed a point raised in the chat, to what extent the wine experience can be applied to the cheese industry. Hazel, you wanted to just respond on that point of the reason for the EU's system of GIs?
Yes, I'd actually like to respond to two things that Bruce, well, first let me thank John for his very good discussion of the problem with evocation as an extension of GI policy and the comparison of those last two cheeses in that last slide, because that was really quite a shocking case with a very tenuous argument. It was an example of extreme anti-competitive behaviour by one cheese producer to another cheese producer, and GI policy allowed the company engaging in the anti-competitive behaviour to win, right? But Bruce made 2 points that I'd like to respond to. One is about Australian cheese producers and their vehemence about European names. I've talked at great length with a third generation Sicilian origin, Victorian-based cheese producer that exports about a third of its product to East Asia. It makes only Italian-style cheeses, and the originator of the company started by making cheese for his family and then his friends, and then it kind of grew from there, and now it's a big company that provides excellent product across a wide range of Italian-style cheeses to the market. But it's the origin that I would like to emphasize, and that is foreigners in a foreign land, which, as you can tell from my accent, I am, do like to have food from home. And if they can't get food from home, then they make the best thing that they can. Now, this particular company shared with me some interesting extracts from newspapers in the late 1940s and early 1950s of it, and particularly about an Italian deli owner in Lygon Street who used his initiative to try and introduce Parmesan to the local community. So he chopped up his Parmesan into small blocks and typed up some, well, wrote or hand wrote or whatever, gave instructions, delivered these small pieces of Parmesan with instructions about how to use it around to the households in the local community and told them where they could come to buy more if they liked it. So my perception of all these immigrants from Italy, let's say, coming to Australia is that they developed product that was not available in Australia. Further, they developed a market for those products that went beyond the Italian community. And it is only after the development of cheap, refrigerated global transportation that Europe has come in and say, hey, cease and desist. But my perception is that it's the Europeans who actually want to piggyback on the work that the Italian immigrants have done in terms of building demand. So that's just a different perspective on the vehemence, because these companies, it could be their livelihood if they're not allowed to keep marketing what they're marketing, right? But I would take strong exception to the idea that the EU's policy is based on rural development. I know that GIs are in the Agriculture Directorate, but all the work that we did up at the ANU under our Jean Monnet project was about trying to trace all the empirical evidence that was available about the impact of GIs, the real world impact on GIs, on producers. Our critical questions were, does it make producers better off? All right, so question one, well, the first question is, will consumers pay more? And if consumers won't pay more, then, the whole policy fails. But if consumers will pay more, then it becomes important how many of them will pay how much more, and does that result in an increase in the net income of the producer? And does it result in an increase in the net income of producer for enough producers for it to contribute to regional development? And Bruce, I'm sorry, but there is no evidence. Almost all of our evidence from Europe, and I would say to the Europeans, if the purpose of GI policy in Europe is about making rural producers better off, and regional communities better off, it's not working. And you need to really evaluate it properly. The evaluations done by the EU on GIs don't merit the term. And I would ask in respect of Australia, where are the regional development authorities in this discussion? Absolutely agree that regions need proper marketing and provenance and all the rest of that. But I really don't think what the EU's developed in terms of GIs is the way to go. Let's get the regional development authorities in, discussing what regions need, because Australian regions produce a wide range of products. And the EU style, which is narrowly focused on Camembert de Normandie or Brie de Meaux, whatever it is, just doesn't work for the nature of Australian regional communities. So,
yes, perhaps Bruce, you could comment on the scope of GIs for regions. We've been talking a lot about names and styles, but that was where I came into wanting to look at this, was our usage of European cheese names. But looking at it from a regional development perspective, and John, perhaps you can comment on this for New Zealand as well. I've learned through my journey through Australian cheeses with European names that I've learned a lot of regions that are producing cheese, mainly river valleys, I guess. What is the scope for, in fact, developing a GI system for cheese and other food products?
no demand.
I'll maybe talk to that from a New Zealand perspective and just respond a little bit to Bruce's comments, if that's okay, Matt.
Yes, please.
Yeah. So I think I probably differ a little bit from Bruce in a couple of areas. I think certainly from New Zealand's perspective, I think what I've been talking about here is really recognizing that there is a difference in approach between how EU and New Zealand treats GIs and how that would impact if it was applied in New Zealand. I think it's probably, I would characterize it as being more factual and defensive. And I think in the case of New Zealand, I struggle to agree that the vehemence about defending the use of these traditional cheese names is about kind of indicates or implies some sort of guilt about using those names, because it's simply the case that these names are how the market recognizes these products, and there's no simple, easy substitute for feta or Parmesan, in the New Zealand context. And if you were to change that, there would be a huge cost. There would be a cost of changing packaging, but there'd also be a cost of marketing and re-educating customers and all of this sort of thing, which would be very much to the disadvantage of New Zealand producers, including regional producers. And in terms of regional development, I do agree, Bruce, that GIs can be a tool. I think that if you see GIs as a kind of a form of collective brand that can pull marketing investment, they can be very useful. They're not a magic wand. They're kind of worth what people are willing to invest in them. However, I would say that, and I've had a lot to do with driving forward the New Zealand wine GI agenda, and I would say that regional development using GIs doesn't require us to adopt the EU model, which really just doesn't sit within our legal system. You would have a lot of, collateral issues raised with, for example, if you had such an expanded scope of protection as they have in Europe for their GIs, you would have issues with fairness in the IP system in terms of trademarks. You would really have problems accommodating it conceptually, because there just aren't equivalent concepts to evocation or this sort of impacting on reputation or things like that within our existing legal framework. So I think that, yes, it's a great regional development tool, but you know, that doesn't necessarily mean that we should welcome the whole EU type system in order to have that regional development benefit.
Yes, that's always the dilemma, how much of it, if any, to take. Bruce, did you want to just comment on that regional development aspect?
Look, thank you, John, and thank you, Hazel, for the responses. I think, Hazel, I mean, the question of data, you're presumably, when you talk about the EU studies not having the not being worth it, you know, that there has been substantial work done. I'm referring particularly to the 2017 study, which claimed that the sales value of products covered by the study was on average double that of the sales value for similar products without certification. So the EU certainly does. The EU certainly does have evidence about the value of the GI system to producers. I'm not in a position myself to comment whether that study is accurate or not, but certainly they do have evidence which supports their claims. And look, John, I appreciate. I mean, I think I wouldn't be advocating that Australia adopt the EU GI scheme per se. I think the question is, in the absence of a satisfactory scheme at the present time, what would be appropriate to provide guarantees of provenance to producers who believe that's an important part of their marketing claims. And perhaps like you'd know more than me that the wine industry is one where you can see some pretty good starting points for how that system has worked effectively.
We have a question about whether this focus on GIs in the export sphere is connected to the decline of the general level of support under the Common Agricultural Policy. So again, perhaps that's something you could comment on, Bruce.
I don't personally think so, but I'm not privy to that level of conversation within the CAP process. I mean, I think the focus of the reform of the CAP has been much more about how it supports the EU's Green Deal agenda, as it's now known and framed as it's been developing over the last 5 years, rather than per se. But there is no question that agricultural producers in Europe, as everywhere, have become much more significantly incorporated into globally competitive markets. That was the case certainly 2 decades and even a decade ago. I think that does remind me of one point. Again, Hazel, I could only say with respect to the origins of the GI scheme that certainly it's DG Ag, its people involved directly with the GI scheme who make that claim about its purpose being regional development. So again, it can be questioned for sure, but that's as they position it themselves.
Now, we've taken very different approaches to dealing with the EU on wine. I've noted that the wine experience has lessons for cheese and other foods, but there's also extensive trans-Tasman cooperation on food standards. How much scope is there for trans-Tasman cooperation in the response to the EU's wishes in this area? Perhaps Hazel, you might start commenting on that.
There was a bit of an uproar a while back about, there was an EU proposal that food had to be labelled with the country of origin, and it led to absolute uproar, but I can't quite honestly remember the details. I find the use of the wine analogy interesting. I think wine is a bit different in that there's a reasonably large share of the wine market that has a price premium anyway. People are looking for a quality product and they look for it in different ways. And I think that when you try and think about comparable food products and how much premium people will pay for what kind of food, we're in a different category. But there are over 100 willingness to pay studies, and there have been meta-analyses of the willingness to pay studies. And certainly if I were to pick food products where I would think some kind of quality labeling could be useful, I would be saying coffee, ham, cheese would be the kinds of products I would look at. But with all due respect to the EU, the studies such as the Repeat and International Update, which brings us up to 2017 from 2012, which is a minor improvement, but that study looks at certain indicators which are not about how much better off people are. And there's going to be the WIPO symposium on GIs is going to have a session where, and that's in August, so you might just have a look for it. There's a session where one of the authors of the AND International study will be participating in a panel, and so will I. But we looked very carefully at the earlier study, and we found it very deficient in a number of respects. And we found that the EU's case study work, such as by RMIT, you can't generalize from that. So, I mean, I think that people who think the GI approach is good, I mean, to me, the big question is, if you were a practitioner, when would you go to a producer and say to them, given the characteristics of your product, a GI type system will benefit you, as opposed to any other thing they could do to raise their net income? And we simply don't know enough, right? So I'm looking for a matrix that shows me across the different kinds of products and the different attributes of the products, when will this particular thing work, right? Because the first thing that has to work is that the quality has to be higher, and you have to get the price premium. Now, if I come back to wine and look at wine and GIs for a comparison, if I'm buying a bottle of sparkling wine from the Champagne region of France, I'm not going to go into a shop and say, can I have a bottle of champagne? I'm going to go into a wine shop, and I'm going to ask for a bottle of Veuve Clicquot, right? If you're buying at that end of the market, you are probably buying a trademark product. And it is very difficult, both philosophically and practically, to separate out the impact on value and value to who, the value to the consumer, the price premium, the return to the producer, with a lot of measures. How do you separate out between the intrinsic quality of the product, whatever labeling does in sending a signal, and how much the labeling differs between the GI label or the trademark label? It's difficult. And just as a final point, I find it interesting that EU GI policy developed in 1992, right in the middle of the global attack on the Common Agricultural Policy.
Now we have a question about what foods might be next. Originally, I was thinking to have a discussion about perhaps cheese, ham, and olives to complete the antipasto. But what are the implications for the other foodstuffs? You've mentioned some of them, Hazel, but John, what about in New Zealand? What else might be a candidate? We also heard about the non-protection of kiwi fruit grown in the EU. So what other foods are sort of coming down the line that is going to be subject to this sort of controversy?
Well, I'm just going to have a look at my list on my other computer, but the negotiating agenda had a very long list of names, 2,200. I think around about 1,700 of them were wine. There were spirits, and then there was a group of beer and other foods. So, you know, in the context of the negotiation, there's obviously a bunch of other food products that, you know, will be the subject of negotiation about the extent of protection. You know, I'm not sure how controversial most of them are. Probably the one that jumped out for me looking at the list would be Kalamata, which is a Greek olive GI, but also a variety of the olive tree, at least as it's understood in New Zealand. Yeah, so I mean, there may be other issues. Maybe I'll just take the opportunity also just to talk a little bit about the wine side of things, because I have had a great deal of experience with that, and probably have a slightly different perspective to Hazel. And that I think the thing about I mean, GIs are important for wine because they're kind of, I guess the way wine is a very highly differentiated product, and it's differentiated geographically to a far greater extent than most other products, including cheese. But at the same time, I think GI systems and GI protections themselves don't necessarily create the value. The value is about what's behind them, what's invested in them by the producers. So what a GI does, as I see it, it's you know, from the perspective of an IP right, it's a collective IP right that is to some extent protectable, that gives a whole bunch of small producers with small marketing budgets something that they can collectively invest in. And I think that's a useful thing, but it's only worth what, you know, what people invest in it, what the quality of the product, how far people are willing to go with it, unless of course you have a large support budget behind you, in which case it's a slightly different equation. But I think one of the key points about New Zealand wine geographical indications is that we have a registration system now, and we have registered them, but all of the value in those names was created without a formal GI registration system, because you know, people went out there and had coordinated research and investment projects behind them. So there's kind of no magic, particularly in just the name of having a GI or the idea of having a registration.
I say in Australia we have awareness of some New Zealand wine regions, but when it comes to cheese, I think the whole of New Zealand is a good brand for us. And we have a question about whether FTAs, the countries where there have been FTAs concluded, that there's been an increased sale of the protected products. So I don't know if any of the panel have a view on that.
I've replied to Frank on that one, because if you go back to the trade treaties, they're quite recent, and there's not enough time yet. So if you look at these trade treaties here that I'm sharing now, they've only started to be implemented just a few years ago. It's very early to tell. But there's quite an interesting website called the Observatory of Economic Complexity. Do not let the name put you off, because it's a really good website. If you go, and it's run by the MIT or something, and the data's World Bank data on global trade, and you put in cheese, you will find all kinds of interesting things. And you can go to Korea, and you can look at Korean cheese imports over the years. And the source of the cheese imports radically changes from period to period, depending what's happening globally in trade negotiations and so on. So it would be quite fascinating to get some research going on Korean imports of cheese and what drives the source, especially as the Koreans are trying to walk this delicate line between the US market and the EU market, and both of these as major trading partners. And it's also interesting for Australia because about 4% of our cheese exports go to Korea. So it's a significant market for our cheese exporters. And I would love somebody to do some empirical work about it and kind of try and suss out how it all works and what goes on. But in the meantime, I might also share with you some data that I put together but didn't share earlier on some of the specific names that were requested and some of the objections that might be put up to the names that they propose for protection in Australia. So these ones, for example, are misleading. These names are all misleading products because the products don't come from the place on the label. So Parma ham does not come from Parma. The pigs grow up all over the place. Braseola della Valentina, I'm sorry, the meat is from Brazil. It might be dried up in this particular valley in northern Italy, but you know, so there's some issues about truth in labeling that the EU needs to deal with. Then there's the issue that we've talked about here about when is a name generic and when is a name a place name. Yeah. So nobody has raised any objections to Parmigiano Reggiano being something that is used only for cheeses produced by the consortium and its hundreds of members. But Parmesan is different, right? And as we've discussed before, those early immigrants have helped to create a market from Parmesan. Their Parmesan is labeled differently, and if you prefer Parmigiano Reggiano, you can get it. If you prefer Perfect Italiano Parmesan from New Zealand, you can get it. So there's issues around that. And I must say the example that John put up with Queso Manchego, objecting to its competitor using the term Rocinante, because both of them have dubious links to the guy who went round tilting at windmills. I must say I objected to them being registered here simply because the company is so mean-spirited and anti-competitive. So, you know.
Yes. Yeah. We've had a comment here about Gruyere still being on the free trade list, despite the US declaring it to be generic. But
they wouldn't pay any attention to that. But did you know there's a place in Victoria called Gruyere?
Yes.
And they don't have a cheesemaker at the moment. But why should they not be allowed to call their cheese Gruyere cheese if a cheesemaker decided to establish themselves in the Victorian township of Gruyere?
Yes, that may be a logical consequence of adopting a GI system. Well, I think we've got the makings of our next seminar where we look at some of the other foods that are coming to line and the whole new set of controversies that are going to attach to them. But I certainly think we have traversed a lot of territory in looking at what's happening with cheese and with the negotiations that are going on, and that we do also have some recently concluded agreements, and we can see what the effect of those has been. Now, the recording is going to be available on our different sponsors' websites, and I thank the participants very much for their presentations and for the questions that we've had. And we're going to, I guess, wait and see what the response is going to be, how the free trade agreements develop, and whether GIs are included and whether there's a separate intellectual property component. So there's a lot in this space to watch. So I thank the participants very much.
Pleasure.
And thank you very much for the audience for coming along. I hope you've been able to have some wine and cheese while listening, and much food for thought as well. So
thanks very much from me to Hazel and John, and thanks to all of the participants and to you for your chairing, Matt.
Thank you.
Interesting, very interesting discussion. So thanks.
Thank you. I look forward to seeing you all at our next ESAANZ seminar.
Everybody.
Thanks all. Matt, have you got one moment?
Yes.
Thank you so much, Hazel. That was fantastic.
Take care.
Yes, thank you very
Send
much.
me the participant list in due course. That would be great.
Yes, I'll be able to send you the list that had registered from on the Eventbrite. I don't have a list of everyone who was in here per se though.
Hey, I might be able to add to that because I did some noting while there were other things going on.
But what I was going to say was we had a peak audience of 46, which I thought was fantastic.
And a total audience of more than that, because there were additional people coming in, though the numbers weren't going up.
Yeah, I would say we had well over 50 people that came in, yeah.
Some people who sampled it, perhaps.
Indeed. But that was good. And I think we had a seminar on this last year as well, and it's proving I think a lot of people are quite interested with this topic, and you get a lot of different people, a lot of different audiences too, not just outside of our regular EU studies people. So it's proving a very good topic of discussion.
Thank you. And Hazel, I don't know if you saw how many of the people you invited came in.
At least two, one from Foreign Affairs, one from IP Australia, and Wenting from our show, who does the East Asian GIs. I also noticed that there was a request from somebody to connect more. Now, we've got a GI mailing list that we run out of the ANUCES that I should have thought about when you were first proposing the seminar, but everything's just a bit mad at the moment. But if you want to do like a follow-up to share the recording once the recording's up somewhere.
Yes, Brad, sorry, Brad, I was going to ask you if you can harvest the chat, and that will yield some new contacts that we don't have in the attendance list.
Yeah, I'm going to try and do that now. Yep.
The other thing is, Matt, that if you do an email to participants telling them where they can look at the recording,
yes,
we can pull that information into our GI mail list thing, and we can send out that information more broadly, including an invitation to people who are on this